Hello everyone and welcome to our panel discussion on the EV supply chain, where we'll be discussing resiliency, circularity and what new entrants to this sector should be considering. I'm Nino Di Cara, founder of Electric Autonomy Canada, and I'm delighted to moderate today's discussion, which is sponsored by TrueCommerce DI Central. The TrueCommerce DI Central automotive supply chain solution brings scalable and bidirectional integration platform as a service solutions designed for the digital transformation of manufacturers in the automotive industry, regardless of their size. With visibility into real-time data across systems and processes, their solutions provide enhanced analytics for decision-making, quick response to marketplace changes, rapid ROI, and cost savings. By removing operational hurdles and reducing the risk of unplanned costs, TrueCommerce DI Central champions proactively managing the automotive supply chain, reshaping processes and preparing for future needs. And we're grateful for their support for this webinar today. The automotive industry is undergoing its greatest transformation and disruption that it's experienced for decades, and the pandemic has created a set of unique issues for the supply chain. But the transition to EVs is driving a wholesale rethink as automakers look for innovation among the supply chain, but also look to integrate more work in-house. So how should manufacturers and suppliers come together to make the most of the opportunities presented by the growing EV industry and supply chain? Well, that's what we'll be tackling today with a great panel of experts who I'll introduce you to in a moment. Before I do, some quick housekeeping. If you have questions, please add them in the Q&A section and we'll get to them at the end of the webinar. If you're making a general comment on the conversation, but not asking a specific question, if I could ask you to please put those comments in the chat section, and that helps us identify questions from general comments. But I would like to encourage you to please do put your questions in the Q&A section as we're going through the conversation today, and we look forward to addressing those at the end. Right, well, let's meet our panel. They are Eva Ames, Vice President of the Electrification and Mobility Competence Centre at DSV, Jared Nyet, President of ProEV, a division of Electrical Components International, John Laughlin, Chief Technology Officer, NGen, that's Next Generation Manufacturing Canada, and Sean McEwen, Regional Vice President of TrueCommerce DI Central. Well, welcome to the panelists, and if I could invite you to introduce yourselves, and Eva, perhaps you'd like to kick us off.
Great, thanks, Nino. Hi, everyone. My name is Eva, and I work for DSV. DSV is one of the largest freight forwarders in the world, and I lead our Competence Center, which is dedicated to customers who are working on electrification and future mobility concepts. I come from the automotive industry. I have a degree in mechanical engineering and started my career as a design engineer. I've also spent time working as a regulator for the US government. And later on in my career, I got into supply chain and logistics. So I've worked for companies large and small, and I'm excited to talk about EV supply chain today.
Great, glad to have you with us. And John, perhaps you'd like to go next.
Sure. I met Eva a couple of weeks ago. We have quite a similar background. I moved to Canada about 3 years ago. I'm the CTO for NGen. I've spent almost all of my career either working in the automotive industry or with the automotive industry. I worked at Ford and then Visteon in Europe and Asia and the UK. I worked for a small hydrogen fuel cell integrator at one point in London, and I ran the UK government's R&D investments in advanced propulsion systems for zero-emission vehicles and connected autonomous vehicles. And I was setting up a not-for-profit on connected autonomous vehicles for the UK government in the UK. When I bumped into a Canadian delegation, we got chatting. They introduced me to Jay Myers, who's the CEO of NGen, and before I knew it, I was invited to move to Canada. So it's been a great couple of years here in Canada. NGen is a not-for-profit that's been set up to build world-leading advanced manufacturing capabilities. We have 3 programs and about to announce a 4th, and I've spotted a federal government employee, so I best not mention the 4th program yet. But so we won the initial supercluster funding, which which was $230 million that we invested into 166 projects, which leveraged a total of $600 million worth of new advanced manufacturing projects. We have a program we run for NRC IRAP and additive manufacturing. We're bidding in for a slice of the 750 million that was announced in this budget for the global innovation clusters, and we've got a fourth program coming in the next sort of 48 weeks. So watch that space. If you want to know more about NGEN, please reach out to me. I'm always happy to chat. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, John. And Jared.
Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jared Connect. I'm the president of Pro EV, which is our electric vehicle division of Electrical Components International. So Electrical Components International, we're a global engineering manufacturing business with 37 facilities and 25,000 employees around the world. We focus on electrification, so providing wiring harnesses, electromechanical assemblies for OEMs. Very heavily invested in working in the electric vehicle segment, specifically in commercial industrial vehicles. My personal background, I'm a CPA by trade, but jumped into the world of industry about 15 years ago, and have been leading this business for almost 10 years. And we're very excited about the space and driving change in manufacturing and technology. So we love to partner with people like NGEN as well. We're working with them on some next generation technologies, and our OEMs who are really trying to scale their EV manufacturing and aspirations for new vehicle platforms.
Great to have you here, Jared. Thanks. And Sean.
Thanks so much, Nino. I'm Sean McEwen, the Vice President here regional for DI Centric Through Commerce. We're a B2B company that is radically focused in mission on automating the EV, industrial, and automotive segments. I come from a mobility background in data for the past 20 years, so mobility, smart city, and for the past 5 years in automotive. What is really intriguing about this panel is just the dynamic approach from both a Canadian and US perspective, as well as looking at it from a holistic. So today I'm really excited to hear from Eva, John, and Jared on some of their approaches and in the market space as well. So great to be on board. Thanks, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Sean. Great. Well, thanks everybody for the introductions, and let's move into the session. And John, if I could invite you to give us an overview of the automotive supply chain as you see it today, and the extent to which it's EV ready and EV capable.
Yes, not a small question, and a great one to kick off, I guess. A couple of things to unpack there. At a high level, the Canadian automotive supply chain brings in about $35 billion in revenue every year, and employs about 100,000 people in Canada. The most significant proportion of that is powertrain, which is the portion that's at risk as we shift from internal combustion engine technologies to EVs. $11.5 billion of revenue it's contributed towards powertrain components, of which 10.9 billion is for internal combustion engine components here in Canada. So there's a small proportion that is currently 600 million that currently supplies EV components in Canada. That's primarily to medium and heavy duty vehicles as it stands today. The nature of the Canadian supply chain is that it's highly integrated with North America. Only 3% of Canadian automotive products shipped outside North America. 16% is shipped within Canada, and 81% is shipped across border and is fully integrated with the EV supply chain, which I think is an interesting, an interesting piece of analysis when we think about our partners with the US and what we need to achieve together. The Canadian landscape's a really interesting one from a supplier perspective. Two companies make up 25% of the of all Canadian revenues, Magna and Linamar. The next two largest suppliers within the supply chain, you could say, would be Ford and GM's engine plants. They have 3,000 employees and contribute $3.7 billion in revenue. So when you look at where the revenues are within the Canadian supply chain, they're with big companies. It's pretty dominated by the large companies. In fact, nearly 50% of all revenues come from 10 major companies. So that has with it risks, but the opportunities are that, I guess this goes to your last point of the question, is how ready is Canada for that EV transition? Is it the market's growing? So the market's still small on the EV scale. It's about 9%. The next 8 years is going to grow to about 45%. I think actually those numbers are starting to get out of date. Things are moving a lot faster. And internal combustion engine components are going to drop from 91% down to 55%. So there'll be a volume shift. There'll be a product shift. And so when we think about manufacturers, what they need to be ready for, they need to be ready for quite a big transition. Pivoting away from the components they make today, a powertrain has, an internal combustion engine powertrain has close to 2,000 moving powertrain components. An EV powertrain has maybe 20. I think Tesla's got 17. So the powertrains themselves are going to get significantly simpler. And we need to think about how do we grow new supply chains and new value chains in order to grow and offset the sort of product mix. I'm going to put on my advanced manufacturing hat, building in manufacturing flexibility in order to weather those volume and product mixes. We need greater visibility in the supply chain, greater resiliency, and we need flexibility within the production processes themselves. How ready is Canada? And this is something last year we were really kind of wondering about. So we took the rest of our funding from the federal government and we put every dollar we had towards a manufacturing EV challenge. We got $180 million worth of projects bid in. We identified potentially up to $500 million worth of projects, but they weren't quite ready in terms of their investment and R&D cycles. And we threw all of our money on that and funded $76 million of new manufacturing processes, green manufacturing processes for extraction of lithium, a new battery innovation center down in Windsor with Flexion, Ventra, Flexingate. So the market responded really, really well. And what we uncovered right across Canada, across all the provinces, of the projects we funded, half of them had interprovincial collaboration. What we found was gems, companies that just hadn't heard of each other. So we took all of that knowledge and we built an EV map and we published it on our website as a free resource to everyone. So we're continuing to identify and find all the companies in the EV space. And we're continuing to publish that data for the good of everyone. So Canada is getting there. There's lots of capability. The market's growing, so the window is now. There's no time to delay in investments. And I think Canada can grow with that market shift as we move up in the next 8 years.
John, thanks. That's a great comprehensive overview. So I guess from an EV point of view, you highlighted 9% is where we're currently at, but that's rapidly changing. And Jared, you've been part of that 9% for some time, manufacturing a critical component for EVs. What's your view about the companies who have the potential to enter this supply chain, and how certain new entrants and some of the legacy manufacturers, as John was referencing, may not feel like they know the sector well enough, or they don't have the products to offer? How would what would be your address to those organizations?
Another interesting question. So from our perspective, we started, so we've been in the electronics business for 35 years. And as ECI, we've been in the electronics business for 60 years. So we've seen lots of transitions through different technologies, right? Telecom and automotive and different sectors. And so we began supporting electric vehicle manufacturers about 7 years ago, when frankly, it wasn't very sexy at that time. I think today it's the buzz, everybody's excited about it, electrifying all different types of vehicle platforms. Our focus is commercial, industrial, recreational. So everything that's not a passenger vehicle are really the products and the OEMs that we work with the most. And starting from 7 years ago, again, working with startup companies, and still today working with startups, medium-sized businesses, as well as large OEMs, all trying to electrify different vehicle types. And what we started to notice, we started to build our expertise in the sector with cabling and harnesses. Really, that's our core business, which is essential to the EVs to transmit power and signal to different functionalities of the vehicle. There's even more cable in these vehicles than there were in the traditional ICE vehicles. So more content, more technology, right? And we're seeing that the segments are seeing their products as much more of a technology product, more similar to an iPhone than an actual truck or bus or agriculture piece of equipment. So they want to put autonomous driving features and sensors and all kinds of things that weren't necessarily present as much previously. So this was the opportunity for the startup as well as the big OEM to really reinvent all of these vehicles. So that we're seeing that they're taking opportunity to do that, which is great. We love that as being a technology business. We love to help with that, give our insight where we can, and help them with engineering and, of course, manufacturing around the world. Also, what we've seen, and I guess as we partner with these OEMs, they come to us with the great things about their, how they're scaling up and vehicles that they're building, but they also come to us with the challenges as partners. They come to us saying, hey, do you have someone that's great for plastics manufacturing or metals or adhesives or other components that they're looking for to help them build their vehicles? And of course, we help them any way we can, even though we're not in the adhesives business. We do purchase a lot of components around the world, so we'll try to lend a hand wherever we can. But that started to open our eyes to the fact that in North America, a lot of companies, a lot of manufacturing and engineering businesses who had focused on some amazing sectors from the past, and they're still present today, such as aerospace and medical device and defense and some of these other critical sectors, they have some amazing expertise to offer to the EV market. But they weren't necessarily jumping in because either the excuse was, oh, we never did that before, it's new, we don't know how to really get into it, the volumes, maybe they're not there yet, those kinds of excuses. And really we're trying to change that narrative. So we talk to a lot of companies and tell them, look, jump in, we'll try to help you navigate that, give you some insight. You need to work with the prototypes in small volume and work with these companies to help them scale up. And the large OEMs have the same challenge. They build 500 vehicles, then 1,000, then 20,000, then 100,000, and they scale their production. So you need to partner with them at the early stages. So when the going's tough and they need advice or they need you to build small quantities quickly, that's a requirement. And just adapting your business, and that's what we did in our business, to being dynamic, being flexible, being innovative, because at the end of the day, we're building a technology product. So we have to align ourselves with that and not, stay stuck in some of the old ways that we had previously. So I think that's been our biggest learnings to date and what we've seen in the market.
Well, that's great, Jared. And I think it relates very well to a point that Eva's made in the past around how industries can learn from each other. And obviously there's a narrative around the Silicon Valleyization of the auto industry. And Eva, maybe we can go down the particular topic of recyclability. And you've spoken about the importance of developing a circular supply chain, something mostly new to the automotive industry with the recycling of EV batteries. And there is an opportunity for the auto industry to lead here where perhaps the tech industry hasn't necessarily been as progressive on recycling as they might have been. I'd love you to expand on that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's like Jared was saying, the consumer expectations for any sort of transportation product are changing, whether we're talking about a micromobility scooter, a passenger vehicle, or heavy equipment. At DSV, the Competence Center that I lead supports about 100 of our customers who are working in these types of challenges. And the message is the same. The world is changing, customer expectations are changing, therefore sales models are changing, and it allows them the opportunity to really change the design of their supply chain. What is the automotive supply chain? Traditionally, it's been linear. We start with parts coming into a production facility, we make the vehicle, we sell the vehicle, and maybe there's a little bit of after sales that goes on as well, sales and service support. Do things have to change when you start making an electric vehicle? What does it really mean to be an EV supply chain? People ask that all the time. I don't think you necessarily have to have a different type of supply chain. You can look at it as, well, EVs have fewer components. We have to start thinking about software as a vehicle component, both for production and for after sales. And it's maybe an opportunity for the vehicle manufacturers to do something differently. But there's a huge opportunity here to actually change that and change the mindset and start to think about a supply chain as being circular. And it's a tough concept. And I think that there's a lot of structure at the large traditional OEMs who are making the transition from internal combustion engine vehicles to EVs to try to figure out what this means, because they're rushing to create these electric vehicles. They're learning a lot, they're trying new things, and it can be tough to have the changes in the organization internally to be able to support the concept of a circular supply chain where we don't stop at selling the vehicle and selling the parts. Do we collect some of these batteries and other components on the vehicle that can maybe be repurposed for aftermarket again, brought into second life opportunities, and ultimately perhaps recycled and fed back into the raw material supply chain at the very beginning? It's a tough concept. And even though we've had lithium ion batteries since the late 80s, early 90s, they haven't been at a scale that has made it economically feasible to actually recycle them. So how do we take the academic concept of the circular supply chain and make that a reality, especially in the automotive industry, as we make this shift from traditional automotive into more of a mobility concept? It's a tough call. And internally, we have a lot of large companies that are structured to focus on just one piece. So it can be hard to pull the after sales and the collection back to feeding that into the raw materials at the very beginning. We work with companies that are setting themselves up and they think very traditional about the automotive supply chain, but the volume of batteries that automotive is bringing in from passenger cars alone, and certain to be further scaled by electric vehicles, whether they are battery electric or hydrogen coming in the heavy trucking industry, the sheer volume of the raw material that automotive brings in is opening this world where it does become economically feasible. And are there side benefits that the technology industry can bring in? We talk a lot about the influence of Silicon Valley on the design of the vehicle and the customer expectation, especially as we move perhaps away from private vehicle ownership and more towards concepts like vehicles as a service. So when we talk about how we can have this circular economy and how we can get to this world where we have batteries going into second life and recycling opportunities, it really begins with the upfront strategy. And I think it's going to take some time for us to finally get to an actual automotive circular economy. But there are an awful lot of really smart people working on this. And even though maybe there are a lot of challenges to the recycling techniques today, they're coming. And we all talk about how great it is to be an early adopter and how cool these concepts are. So, it can be really tough to look at the challenges that are ahead and to be ready to volunteer to be the first to tackle those. But we have customers that are working on this. There are others in the industry that are working on this. And the circular economy for the battery supply chain is going to be essential to ensuring that we have enough raw materials to support the volume of vehicles that are coming.
Thanks, Eva. And I recall you mentioning that Renault are undertaking a pilot in Europe, and I wonder if you could maybe just highlight what they're up to with that.
Yeah, I mean, we have several OEM customers that are working at a regional level on circular economy, not only for the batteries, but for the vehicles themselves. Renault is a really cool case study. There's a lot of public information about what they're up to. They've repurposed a plant and they are taking in vehicles and they're harvesting not only the batteries, but also components from those vehicles to either repair the vehicles or repair those parts, harvest them and find other opportunities for them. Pretty innovative stuff. I think that that's a good example of what this could look like for passenger cars.
Thanks, Eva. And Jared, is your product line something that you could see being recycled and you using second-use materials?
I think at the base of it, right, is in a cable, especially high voltage cables, it's mostly copper composition, right, and silicone or other jacketing materials. So can copper be reused? Absolutely. Can it be recycled? Yes. Usually our products have a very long life to them, so it's not similar to batteries where it will degrade, over time. But there's definitely possibilities for that. Recycling in our industry has existed for many years, actually. Recycling of coppers and compounds for jacketing and things like that, and connector materials. So that can definitely continue. But integrating it as part of the strategy of the OEM is very interesting. That's coming up more and more as the OEM really gets control and understanding of all the components of their vehicle architecture and how they're going to continue to supply that, reuse that, and grow their scale over time. So it's definitely something that's on the radar, and we'll, we partner with our companies all the time in looking for solutions of people looking at, well, should we use copper? Do we use aluminum? Do we look at other alternative materials and, 3D print parts and different things like that? So at the end of the day, for us, it's about how do we use technology to build technology-driven products. It sounds simple, but very difficult to do, but that's really the concept.
Here in North America, it's voluntary, right? So our customers can choose to do it. They can choose to wait. They can choose to wait and watch and see what the right answer is. And we're seeing the biggest disruption to the automotive industry that's happened in more than a century. Over in Europe, we see a lot of people working on circular economy initiatives, both from a voluntary standpoint, but also because it's about to be required in EU law. So perhaps some of the innovation that is required by regulation over in Europe will start to penetrate North America and drive some more of these circular economy possibilities.
Great, thanks Eva, thanks Jared. And Sean, Jared was just talking about how technology can enable this, and also about the need for rapid product innovation, and you and I have spoken about the need for radical transformation among the existing suppliers. How can suppliers bring agility and traceability to their international supply chain operations?
Yeah, we're in a very disruptive time, and I'm not sure if anyone's been asleep for the past 3 years, but between COVID, chip shortage, conflict, there's just everyone's at a disadvantage in how do they become nimble and agile, and even collaboration. Just to pick up on Eva's point, that the EV category is not just the cars, we're scooters, we're trucks, we're buses, we're recreational vehicles, we're boats, and just that whole economy and how we support it. We think about China being like an 8-to-1 advantage for batteries on their development side. So 80% of the batteries currently are developed in China. And so how do we build that resiliency here in North America? Do we start to think about reshoring, bringing back resources? And we're seeing that in Georgia with SK Innovations being invested. We're seeing investments in Kentucky and here in the US and up in Canada with Stellantis and Windsor. And so the big challenge is how do we become resilient to stand that up? And the big shift is around visibility. How do we create visibility to monitor? How do we create the agility to react? I was listening to a CEO last week for a major OEM that says, well, I'm constantly on the phone with my suppliers, which is good, but the question is why? Now in a digital transformation where we can basically digitize a workflow, a process, we can shorten operations, and China can automatically look in, and folks that are still stuck in spreadsheets or in ad hoc or data silos, to me, frankly, may be in the graveyard of death, because it's all about being shortening those cycles, getting immediate visibility and being agile. And so I don't think we have to be as reactive. It's about anticipating the changes before they happen. And I think companies don't have to do the big bang. We call the theory evolution, not the revolution. So are there smart phases within that supply chain that maybe the suppliers need a better experience where they can find from planning through to scheduling? So on supply chain side, through logistics and through 3PL. I mean, we find it's a very important opportunity to collaborate with partners that bring the edge to it, to RFID, to waste, to manage from the journey where Eva starts at her company all the way through to planning, invoice, all the way through. And I think it's getting very expensive for companies that are stuck in the mode of being We've always done it this way. And I think we're seeing a lot of, on the far side, OEMs that are kind of stuck in that mode of, hey, we don't have everything organized and it's not necessarily digital, but we're on the journey. Where I think the EV companies that are growing have a tremendous opportunity to be thoughtful and mindful, and even pointing to this, to start planning around, well, as we scale, and one of the largest EV companies in the world talks about the disaster of how do we scale beyond 1,000 to 100,000 and beyond. And that's a concern for me. And then we see companies that still need some education about embracing the cloud and the cost of maintenance and the traditional CapEx costs, so maintenance, IT support, and then moving into the OpEx cost of the managed service that takes care of a lot of the burden. And so as we move forward in these areas, I think the automotive had this nuances, right? And we have to understand that MMOG, the Materials Management Operations Guidelines, there's a lot of global standards around the supply chain management process and best practices that we should be aware of. It's almost like we have two camps. We have the EVs on the evolution side that are trying to move as fast as they can, and the automotive on the OEM side. So I think we've got a ways to go on agility, but I think there's a lot of good momentum and good examples of that were successful.
Great, thank you, Sean. And I just take the opportunity to invite the audience to submit their questions on the Q&A channel, and we'll be taking those up a little bit later in the conversation. John, perhaps if we can stick with you, sorry, Sean, if we can stick with you just for another moment or two. You've worked with established automakers as well as companies and businesses born in the EV industry. You touched on some of the legacy thinking of, well, we're doing it the way that we've always done it and it's kind of fine. But I just wondered if you could expand on that a little bit further and highlight the difference that you see in the way that some of these startup businesses are approaching things versus perhaps some of the more traditional approach.
Yeah, I think the EV OEMs are fast and furious, and to me that's a runaway for success and failure. Again, failing to plan could also be detrimental. And when we look at a lot of the EV early startups, we have a lot of IT and software savvy folks, but they may lack the automotive pedigree to move momentum forward. We're also seeing the new buying experience for how we deliver and how we finish the vehicles, and that's a whole brand new way of the end game of how do we ship these products to folks. And then I talk about how they're able to pivot and execute quickly and strategize. And this is a very highly volatile, disruptive. I mean, we could pull out a news clipping from any major OEM EV. I mean, they're committing and promising delivery of X number of vehicles, and then backpedaling to, well, why didn't the street meet that? And the street can talk about, we're writing down 10% because we haven't delivered on expectations. And why is that? Well, we can blame resources, the supply chain's broken, but really, where are we getting that visibility to information throughout the supply chain? I also see on the OEM side that there are very deep pockets, that the risks and opportunities are quite great. And we see some of the traditional OEMs, frankly, are investing heavily. I mean, we see Blue Oval City in Kentucky with Ford investing $11 billion. And then you've got the community that's behind it. So Kentucky was great because economically, it low taxes, great place for people to go. But then you've got the community saying, how do we get resources and talent to places like Kentucky? You've got places like the associations, like economic development. You've got Kentucky Association of Manufacturers that get behind and can help promote. But these are exciting projects. Over in Georgia, we've got Rivian with a $50 billion investment in their EV plant, SK Innovations, and then we see groups like Georgia Automotive Association that are planning thought leadership events like the Southern Automotive Conference that talk about mobility, to Eva's point about the circular economy, and then the EV supply chain. That's a whole different realm that we're seeing. So I think the thread that pulls it all together is that on the far side, we have OEMs and tier ones that are really thinking about how they become agile, compliant, and on the EV side, how do they become nimble and scale to meet the demand over the next 3 to 5 years.
Great, thanks, Sean. And so John, if I could bring you in, Sean's talking about EV OEMs being fast and furious and an attribute coming to a supply chain near you. I guess might be a way of phrasing it. What do you see as the role of the OEM in helping suppliers develop new EV solutions?
Yeah, I think, Jared touched on this a little bit, and Eva, and then Sean. There's a number of factors that are really in this really complex landscape right now. We touched on the point that power chains are much simpler. 2,000 components down to 20. The components are significantly higher value, and actually an EV powertrain is 15 to 20% more expensive than an ICE powertrain, and there's less components. So the OEMs really are becoming more collaborative and looking at their supply chains and looking at potentially bringing their supply chains closer to them, and engine and transmission facilities are going to be affected. So I think we're going to see shorter supply chains, more control of the supply chains. The OEMs are looking for the differentiated product. There's been quite a lot of brand erosion. They're looking at their organization as technology development companies. And then something Eva touched on sort of sparked a thought around sort of the whole environmental footprint. The OEMs were called out. Diesel, I'm from Europe, 50% of the market was diesel. Overnight, mayors of cities were banning diesel engines. I don't think the OEMs going to get caught again by a shift in consumer perceptions of the environmental footprint. We're seeing the OEMs spending a lot more time, a lot of money and effort looking at the whole life cycle and the whole manufacturing footprint of their supply chains. And we're starting to see them become more collaborative in a positive way, but also driving those behaviors down the supply chain. So there's a lot happening on that front. I think Canada is really well positioned from an environmental perspective within the supply chain, cheap green electricity, ethical processes, processes of green lithium extraction, reduced water, 50% energy reduction. So I think the OEMs are driving that. They're looking for the differentiated product. There's a lot of factors in play that are being seen through the supply chain. And my last thought on that is that there's got to, the powertrain, the EV powertrain, certainly at the moment for the next 8 to 10 years, is going to be more expensive than internal combustion engine powertrain. So the costs of those of that system can't all be swallowed either by the consumer or the OEM. So there's going to be stronger relationships and cost pressures pushed down the supply chain. So we'll see how the supply chain kind of weathers that as well.
That one, John and Jared, and maybe Eva, but I'm curious on the we can build it ourselves mentality versus collaborating and finding smart partners for that. And maybe Jared, you see this more as an OEM, but I am curious on the mentality that we've got the talent, the resources, the wherewithal to take it in-house versus finding folks that have a pretty much complete solution partner. And is that an agility, get to market faster, dominating? Because this is a very competitive business. So I'm curious on, to taking off John's part of, are we connecting the dots here in Canada and the US on better collaboration? Is that an opportunity or is that a failure?
I'm the only one unmuted. I think there's an opportunity there. Europe tried to catch up with China. All of the member states got together and collaborated, and they had to, and they started in 2017. It's taken them 5 years to get a reasonable position. North America's coming at this later, and I just cannot, with such a highly integrated value chain, between our countries, there has to be stronger collaboration. There's a window of opportunity here that if it's missed, then a big market share in multiple areas will be lost. And Eva's unmuted, so I can hand over to her.
This is the time to be trying new things. Automotive loves vertical integration. We love to bring things in-house. So on the one hand, I think it makes a lot of sense, and this is a typical pattern of behavior in the automotive industry. We need to figure this out, and no one's going to figure this out like we can. At the same time, though, saying that we're going to start designing our own powertrains to the level of designing a cell chemistry internal to a car company is like saying that the car companies are going to start blending their own gasoline. So it's a huge shift. And even though the high tech industry definitely gave a leg up on creating the lithium ion battery to the point where we're able to put it in existing electric vehicle powertrains, that's great. And even though we can still say that the lithium ion battery in a cell phone is not too different from the battery that's being put into a car, just at a different scale and a different energy density, I mean, that's great. But at the same time, the car has unique challenges, not only from a performance standpoint, but from a regulatory requirement standpoint that are pushing the OEMs to think a little bit differently and try to figure out what is the best strategy for insourcing this. You see a variety of different strategies from a bunch of the different OEMs that Sean mentioned even. Are we going to bring this 100% in-house? Should we partner with an existing battery company? Should we form a joint venture with them? Should we just outsource it to them because they know what they're doing? And should we treat this a little bit more like your typical critical automotive component and source this to a bunch of different suppliers? I think that there's a huge propensity to find the answer. What is the answer? And right now there simply isn't one.
Thanks. Jared, I see you're off mute. I don't know if you, or John, I don't know if either of you guys want to jump in.
Yeah, I'd say from our experience, and I'll speak specifically on commercial, industrial, recreational, okay? So everything that's not a passenger vehicle. Almost every company that we work with goes through this evolution, right? These thoughts of, well, if they're a bigger established OEM, they say, we've developed ICE vehicles many years, let's try to do as many things as possible. Usually when that happens, it goes for a while, and then it gets to a point when the pain starts. And the pain is they're trying to scale their production, or they're trying to improve weight or improve cost, or adapt their vehicle to a customer's need or specification that they'd like to sell to. And as soon as that starts to happen, they start to realize that they need very strong partners who likely know these components and things better than they do. And what we love about what we're seeing in the sector is, whether they're a startup or an established OEM, majority are coming to the realization that they need partners to work with them, because they themselves, even though they might have been around for the last 40, 50 years, they admittedly say that we don't know that much about this specific component of this type of vehicle. And I'm only speaking, of course, from a wiring perspective. So high voltage wire harnesses, wiring, low voltage harnesses, anything that's the electrical systems of the vehicles. There's very different parameters now that apply to an electric version rather than an ICE vehicle. And then so it starts to change in how much depth of knowledge they need to have in our particular segment to make those products better. They will never have that depth, because this is all we do all day long for 50 other people, right? So using the knowledge of that, how the industry's going, what this looks like, from things from charging ports and different connectors to use and temperature requirements. And then in our segments, when you add in the other flavor, which is it's a commercial, industrial, recreational, right? It's something someone's going to beat up. This is a delivery truck. This is a school bus. This is they're not being careful with a vehicle like this, and they're operating them sometimes 24/7. So you throw that onto the mix too, and all these different experiences that we could share from that kind of more rugged environment, and the electrification experience, coupled with seeing what the market is doing in all of those different sectors, is very, very powerful and almost irreplaceable. And if you try to do it yourself, it's going to take you 5 years, at which point you've already lost the race because someone else beat you to it 4 years earlier. So that's the other issue. So you could try to do it yourself, but you're just going to be too slow. So sometimes it takes the OEM a little longer to realize that, but once they do, it flips very, very quickly. But a lot of our customers have already realized that from the onset, but they're begging for a better, more robust supply chain with regard to all of their parts. And this is across North America. We see this from the US, and we see this in Canada as well. everything that they need. They're so happy when they find suppliers willing to partner with them when the going is tough, as well as when the going is good, and help them develop these solutions collaboratively. Much more open to that than in the past with ICE vehicles, where I think the OEM felt like they had all the experience they needed in-house to do it. Now they don't. So I think that's shifted drastically.
I would say that at the same time, though, I think that there's a lack of trust from the OEM level, especially as new players come in here trying to be the first. There are a lot of companies that are coming in thinking a little bit differently, and maybe they're going to be the first in the market, but there is a lot to be said for the traditional mobility background in terms of the demands of the vehicle, especially as what you're saying, Jerry, right? With the industrial customers, that vehicle has to keep working. We can't have downtime. It has to have a much longer life cycle than your typical tech product. There are regulatory challenges with this. We have to ensure people's safety, much, much higher risks involved. And I think that especially when it comes to the longevity that the product has to last and the complexity of just making a car and the demands of what people do with it compared to where a lot of these newer suppliers come from, I think that there's a lack of trust that is pushing OEMs, and I'm not just talking about passenger cars, across all the different mobility segments, pushing them into their comfort zone of vertical integration because they just don't know who to trust. There's a huge demand to look for partners, but there are a lot of false prophets out there right now.
I wanted to key on that if I can real quick. Eva's like, we're also seeing a graveyard of companies that are failing, and the trust goes both ways. We see trust being, hey, you've signed up all these companies that are in the construction business, and you promise to deliver X, but when the fruition of that is not realized, sure, I'll put $100 or $1,000 in that vehicle, but we're not meeting expectations. Or is it a recipe for failure? Are we seeing these organizations that don't have the infrastructure, don't have the resources to support it? And how do we make them aware of that? So, I mean, I would value your input on trust on that one.
Such a great point there, right? I mean, you see a lot of cool companies that had amazing ideas, but when it came time to scaling that up for mass production or figuring out how to actually manufacture that, they fell flat. It's not necessarily that the idea was bad or the product wouldn't have been great. It's because they're trying to insource too much. And I think that there's a huge underestimation on the complexity of building a car, and there's a massive underestimation on the complexity of the supply chain. If we've got 2,000 to 5,000 assemblies coming in to build the car at the production line, and we're thinking about automotive supply chain only as getting parts from tier 1 suppliers into the production facility, we're doing a gross disservice to the actual complexity of the supply chain going down to the tier 2, tier 3 levels. That lack of visibility and that lack of planning is what we're seeing with the current chip crisis. And then the concept that it stops there and not even thinking about after sales and long-term support for these vehicles has been a real killer. So looking at the future of potentially having a more circular economy for the supply chain, it requires a lot of upfront planning, and it requires the time and the investment to design that in from the very beginning. On top of that, thinking about supply chain as being a strategic advantage. It's not transactional. It's not one lane at a time. It's a full-on network. Designing that from the beginning, making sure that you can constantly optimize that, making sure that you're doing everything you can to keep that line running, keep customers happy, forming that circle, and at the same time layering in new sustainability and ESG initiatives. So I guess just to close that out, I mean, look at some of these startups that have cool ideas and are maybe thinking that they will not manufacture their own product. There seems to be this new trend that some of these startups are looking towards contract manufacturing, and we're going to see a little competition soon between the traditional automotive contract manufacturers and some of the new contract manufacturers who have come from the tech space and are going to start on electric vehicles, even here in North America. So it's pretty cool times. And I think that a lot of the companies that haven't made it in the past would tell you that it really came down to a lack of strategy and a lack of understanding about how supply chain affects actual operational success.
I think it's fascinating to hear the tensions on OEMs as they look to vertically integrate and follow the Tesla model of doing everything in-house, but with so much else going on, as you highlighted earlier, Eva, with regard to having to transition to EV, having to build a circular supply chain, and having to rapidly innovate to build in-house capabilities where there weren't none previously. It's huge demands on an organization that's already going through dramatic transformation. John, I saw you speaking earlier, or just unmuting earlier. I don't know if you want to come in on any of the comments that have just been made.
No, I think they've all been well made. But my only last thought, we keep talking about EVs, and you know, you founded an electric autonomy, and connected and autonomous vehicles are not that far away. And as we seem to have this almost, you know, blinkered vision on what can we do for EVs, there is opportunity with regards to new sensors and new other technologies that will be in production fairly soon, to build those capabilities as well. And yeah, it's not just about that. I know this is about the circular EV supply chain, but I can't help but think that connected autonomous vehicles and the shifts in mobility and the shifts in product, and EVs being, you know, the powertrains being right-sized for the type of mobility that the vehicle is going to be used for, all plays to needing a lot more flexibility in the whole value chain, supply chain. Having, to Eva's point, having that visibility, having the traceability, being able to manage much more complex product mixes and volume mixes over the next sort of 8 years.
Huge opportunity, I think, when you bring in the concept of IoT and autonomous vehicles into supply chain. So shifting perspective a little bit, we've been talking about supporting customers and supporting companies that are making EVs. But when we talk about the concept of electric vehicles and connected vehicles and autonomous vehicles coming into the logistics space, tremendous opportunity to have an even more robust supply chain. Maybe it starts with autonomous trucks and IoT connectivity, but wouldn't it be amazing if someday we had a world where we knew exactly what was on every pallet that was loaded into every truck? We knew its exact location. We knew the state of charge of the truck. We know exactly when that truck is going to show up at the production facility or the sequencing warehouse. And we have automated equipment on the line that knows exactly where everything is and can optimize the vehicles being built on the line. I mean, that's the future. And that right there is a super robust supply chain.
Thanks, Eva, and thanks, panelists. We'll take some questions from the audience, and thanks to everybody in the audience who's added questions in. How does the panel feel about the push towards EV, even though most places haven't really got the infrastructure in place for them yet? And I'll just put that out as an open comment to the panel. If anybody would like to take that.
Sean was going to jump in on that one.
Well, my thought is if it's the side of production to release to delivery, there's still education. There's a lot of great groups like EVS Society here in Canada that talk a lot about educating the masses around adoption. That has to happen. The charging network obviously has to mature, and we're seeing a lot of investment as we think about driving across. So obviously Canada, geography-wise, is a challenge, but I go back to Eva's point around a very thoughtful, mindful supply chain that I think we have to think differently to answer that end-to-end solution. But I'm curious in your thoughts on that, John.
Yeah, investment coming in the infrastructure for sure. What gets me in it goes back to sort of 75% of the vehicles are SUVs and light trucks. These are very energy dense and power dense batteries that will be required for an F-150 Lightning truck. And the infrastructure, the charging infrastructure requirement then is going to have to be significantly more robust than what we're seeing in Europe, where my first car was a 1.5 liter, you know, 3-door Corsa, and here everyone expects to have the power and energy density to be able to use their vehicles as they expect. And with that means it's more the distribution nodes or the transformers that need to be upgraded, and that investment has to be there in order to start to be able to manage that transition. And that's coming pretty fast. You know, 2026, 2028, there's going to be cost parity between internal combustion engine vehicles and sort of EVs. And so there is a lot of infrastructure that needs to be invested in. The other aspect, and I know fuel cells are not really being thought about for passenger cars, but for light trucks, medium and heavy duty, I mean, hydrogen as an energy vector is decoupled from the grid and therefore can be transported and stored, and you can, you don't have to keep investing in infrastructure every time you put another 5 vehicles on a block. And so you're actually reducing the amount of infrastructure investment the more you sort of use other energy vectors. So I still think there's a bit of a shift in terms of what the final energy mixes are going to be.
Thanks. So question, perhaps Jared could pick this one up to start. How do you think the slower infrastructure rollout will affect supply in terms of materials for infrastructure, as there is a sudden demand surge as operators try to catch up?
I think everyone needs to hurry up. The last few years have been, yes, there have been supply chain constraints, but there was also an excuse to just be slower when potentially people just had to work harder to figure out solutions. So I think that as long as people and businesses continue with the mindset of don't just accept what was in the past, or I guess accept a complacency of, oh, I can't find this part, I can't get that part. We'll figure out a solution, design something different, design another option, do something, because just delaying the inevitable in the rollout of these infrastructures because of excuses, I don't think that's going to last much longer. So companies that want to adapt, that take that more technology mindset, again, not the, I guess the more old school mindset of just traditional buy components, build the part, etc. They're going to succeed a lot more just because they won't make as many excuses. They'll have a product ready, or if they don't, they'll figure out a new product, or they'll change their product, or they'll do something to allow them to deploy 10,000 charging stations or 20,000 or 100,000 or whatever that is to meet the demand. So I think the law of supply and demand will kind of start to regulate that, where you just won't get away with the excuse at one point in the very near future.
One quick point on that one, Jared, to play off that, a lot of these suppliers can be a 10, 20 person shop and they get the big order. Then what? How do they, wow, we just landed GM or Chrysler or Ford. How do we scale that and then get to your digital first, right? Embrace that. Because it's a level playing field. A lot of these suppliers can be we work with them 5 or 6 or 10, and they need to adapt quickly and have something. But what are your thoughts on that to the panel?
Look, I think unfortunately, look, an OEM and supplier have to they have to choose the right size partner. So if GM chooses a supplier that's 20 people, GM didn't do a very good job at selecting their supplier, which I don't think they would do. The people who are 20 people, 100 person at what, company size companies, they need to figure out a model, or they need to get with someone bigger real quick, because that will allow them to scale. So I take, our business for an example, we're scaling quite rapidly. We're around 250 people here in Canada and growing to probably around 500 in the next 3-ish years. But around the world, we have 25,000 people and 37 facilities that can produce anything at any scale for anyone.
We are unfortunately going to have to wrap it there, Jared. And sorry to cut in there, but we're dead against time.
No problem.
I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions in the audience, but I did want to give this panel as much time to speak as possible. So I do want to say a massive thank you to our panelists for joining us today. So Eva, John, Jared and Sean, absolutely terrific discussion, very illuminating. Thanks for coming on board and sharing your expertise. And a big thank you once again to True Commerce, DI Central for sponsoring this discussion. We're very grateful for them coming on board. And I'd like to let everyone know that we will be sharing a link to a recording of this webinar in the next few days on electricalautonomy.ca. But in the meantime, please sign up for our next webinar, which is on July the 14th. It's another panel of top industry speakers addressing Canada's EV charging infrastructure. If you register for Electric Autonomy's newsletter, you'll receive an invite to that in the next few days. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you on the 14th.